Hey, this is Brookes with Character Design Forge. World building can be one of the most fun and indulgent parts of creating a story. Creating a world similar to ours or different completely, creating a sandbox to play in, asking what-if questions and then realizing them. There's no end to what you can do as far as the breadth of world building. But world building can be a bit of a trap. And if you aren't sure of what you're doing, it can be all the more scary or daunting. Let's figure out how to world build sustainably and maybe help you out if you're stuck. Two main principles to start out with. One of them is that world building is all about rules. Now, doesn't rules sound like fun? It's all about establishing what is and isn't possible in your world, which may be as simple as saying, it's just like our world except frogs have 3 eyes. Or it can be as grand and fantastical as a science fiction universe. The second thing to keep in mind is that world building is not necessarily the same thing as storytelling. And in fact, there are a lot of times that they can be diametrically opposed to each other. Now, for this reason, world building can easily get in the way of storytelling. So any development of the world is going to exist on the back end first. Now, what I mean by that is frogs might have 3 eyes in this world, you know about it as the creator, but you may not necessarily reveal this in the story. Maybe it's a legend or mystery that's only partially known and not an absolute, commonly known fact. Or you may wait a while to reveal it. But you've got, as reference, 3-eyed frogs in your world building. So first of all, rules sounds like a dull thing, but you're just setting up those what-ifs of your world. Maybe it's a system or element that we don't have in our world. Maybe it's a faraway place, maybe it's set in our world, but it's speculative of what will happen in the future, or an alternate history. One of the biggest differences between science fiction and fantasy is usually just how much explanation or understanding there is. Something is only magic when it isn't understood. So someone could move something with their minds, and in a sci-fi world they do this with technology, with some sort of developed power or telekinesis. And in fantasy it could be exactly the same, just not explained as well, or simply given a vague enough explanation like the Force. This works well with things that aren't possible in our world, but it also works when creating a world where things that are very possible and even mundane in our world are a mystery or require a lot of faith in another world. For example, you could have a tribe of mice or small creatures that discover a human object or something. Just remember that in this world that you've created, the rule that you've now made is that those little creatures are sentient and have their own society. An example of this is actually sort of the Lego movie. To them, a tube of superglue has a power beyond something that they understand or are capable of. And this sort of gets explained by the end of the movie, but as far as these characters are concerned, at face value, this is a rare, powerful artifact. Now, you may be having trouble developing these rules though, or you have an empty world and no story to tell, or a fully created sandbox with no story to tell. From here, it's not enough just to have the world, it's figuring out how the characters in this world feel, how they react and live in this world, and what would be important to them. Characters and their motivations are going to have a context that makes sense in your world. For example, if a resource like gold or air is limited in this world, that means you might have different groups fighting to control it. You'll have someone trying to steal gold to pay for their kids' orphanage bills. You'll have a romantic quest for a golden bracelet to prove their love. This is kind of the basis for developing cultures and belief systems for your characters, as there's usually a large part of their environment and circumstance that influences these things. Going back to how known something is, maybe your character's limited understanding or limited understanding generations ago led to the development of practices or traditions. Now, with all of these things, of course you're going to have them be out there. They're different from our world. You're creating a what if. But it is really helpful to have some kind of parallel or something that's relatable to our world so that our audience can relate and care. As much as it might be fun to start figuring out the faster than light engines of the spaceship in your world, if your story is set completely in a high school and surrounds a group of teenage kids that are only concerned with typical teenage struggles, there may be no reason to develop or explain their hyperspace travel. This is again where you need to strike a good balance with the building of a world and the storytelling. Starting off a story with too much explanation or exposition means it's going to take longer to get to the part where we can feel something for our characters, and therefore be less inclined to keep going. Audiences also have sort of a saturation point. If you give them too much info up front, it might numb them to the story later. Despite the fact that your story takes place in a larger fantastical world, you may only need to hint at or develop just enough of the world to show how it relates to our characters in their current setting. Remember that in Star Wars, the most commonly known use of the Force, moving things with your mind, isn't even really used in the first movie. We have Force choking, the mind tricks that Obi-Wan does, and a little bit of a use or belief in the Force at the very end to destroy the Death Star. But it's only in Empire Strikes Back, when Luke is hanging upside down, that he Force pulls his lightsaber toward him from the snow. Instead of taking several paragraphs to explain the history of this world's Zeppelin airship patrols, introduce them through a character's understanding and perspective of them. Have one go by overhead. This gives you a chance to say something about the character too, and how they feel about the airships from their perspective. Your character could be sickened by the intrusive airships, or they could long to be in the clouds piloting one themselves, or they're depressed by the droll, monotonous dirge sound of the engines and desire to be far away from here. And now you've done two jobs at once. You've said something about the world, but also about your character. We do need to be careful here too, though, in how you set up the expectations of the audience. Say your world is exactly like ours, except for the existence of three-eyed frogs, and your story is set in a high school. You may not fully explain the idea of three-eyed frogs immediately, but you should try and set up or hint at the existence of them, or the possibility of them, as early as you can. Otherwise, three-eyed frogs suddenly popping up in your story isn't an earned twist or surprise. It's just sort of a, huh? I thought this was a normal high school. Now when you go to add the fun things, the architectural aesthetic of the buildings, the characters that can float in your new helium-filled world, or the language of the peoples, you'll have context for what you're doing and understanding of why it's important and relevant to the story. You'll be able to separate out the real meat of the story from the marshmallow fluff. Now again, feel free to record everything you'd like to about your story, just do so on the side. Create your own encyclopedia of the world if you want to. Just keep it out of the narrative of your story unless you need it to be there. I'm making new videos every week here on Character Design Forge. Subscribing on YouTube lets you know when new videos are made available. You can keep my forge burning over on patreon.com/bageldenizen, where there's going to be some really cool new things in the next couple weeks, so stay tuned for that. You can follow along at bageldenizen on Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch. And this has been a nice set. I know I change things pretty often, but what if this was the last video here? Thanks for watching. Have fun creating. You know, it really is like old Uncle Glomp said before he went off typhoon hunting. Sometimes it just does feel like a season finale. And you can tell it is because I turned the light off.